When Thomas Jefferson gets elected in 1800, he calls it a revolution as real as that of 1776. And he's talking about the changing of parties. There had been one ruling class, the Federalists, and now we're moving into a second, the Democratic Republicans. But in reality, Jefferson was fairly conciliatory. He worked with his opponents, and he was not combative, as that makes him sound to be. Now, Jefferson, of course, was only the second president and the first president to spend his whole term living in Washington, D.C., which works out well for him because it was kind of right by his house. But, of course, he lived in the White House. D.C. in 1800 was a small provincial town, and it was in a swamp. They literally had to drain a swamp to build D.C. there. This is that swampy Chesapeake land that used to kill everybody from malaria back in the day. There's only about 3,200 people in Washington, D.C., which means that the high school I teach at, if you count the faculty and staff, everybody in it in the course of a day, that's about 3,200 people. So that gives you an idea of how small that is. The politicians didn't even live there. It was too small, too backwater. They would come in, do their business, and leave. And it was common for representatives and even one Supreme Court justice to quit their jobs in the middle of their terms to go back and work in the state government. So unappealing was working in Washington, and so unpowerful or so weak was the federal government in these early days. Jefferson was an aristocrat. He was born rich. He had expensive taste, and he lived his life in massive debt. But on the other hand, he also liked to present himself as a common man. There's a great story about Jefferson where on the first day of his presidency, he went into work early at the White House, worked through the morning, walked down the street to his inauguration. There were no balls, there were no celebrations. He gave a brief speech. He didn't dress up. He wore the clothes that he would wear hanging around the house. And then he walked back and went straight back to work. He didn't have any parties afterwards or anything. And this is fairly typical of the way he saw himself and presented himself. He was a widower. His wife had been dead a long time. And he didn't dress up, hardly ever. We have letters of people who say they went to the White House. They didn't know him. These were just random people. And they knocked on the door, and Jefferson answered the door, not his servants. Of course, he had servants. But Thomas Jefferson invited them in, brought them into the kitchen, made them a snack, and sat down and just chatted with them, wearing what would be at the time pajamas, essentially. He saw the job as president as being kind of the top bureaucrat. So he just saw a president as kind of like working at the DMV. There was no DMV at the time, but you get what I mean. Just with a little more power. So maybe like a glorified postman or something, just another federal employee. Which is in sharp contrast to Washington, who was kind of treated like a king, and so was Adams. Washington was very obsessed, by the way, with how everything looked, and he kind of had a court, and he dressed everybody there. He was meticulous about designing their outfits. All the servants and the people who worked there in the White House and the Capitol with him. Jefferson was completely the opposite. He didn't want any of that pomp and circumstance or any of that production. He was an educator, an architect, an inventor, a farmer, a scientist, and a philosopher. He invented a number of things like the dumbwaiter, which is, you can look it up if you want to know. He was the leader of his party. Hamilton had created the Federalist Party, and Jefferson created his own party in opposition, which are called the Democratic Republicans. He was extremely popular during the time he was president. He was, after all, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he's reelected in 1804 by a margin of 164 to 14 over Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. Jefferson thinks the government is too big. In fact, the government is already 3 times bigger than it was in 1793. We have a large public debt and high taxes, which of course is what Hamilton had wanted. In 1802, Jefferson gets rid of all taxation except import duties and the sale of western lands, which isn't really a tax but a sale, and he dramatically cuts government spending. Even while getting rid of all these taxes, he manages to cut the debt America has from $83 million to $45 million. He slashes the army from 4,000 soldiers to 2,500. He believed a standing army was a threat to democracy. Our Navy had 25 ships when he took office. He drops that down to 7. He was worried that having a large army and a navy would make us aggressive in foreign affairs, make us more willing to fight. Yet he also established the military academy at West Point, Army, if you watch college football. And, of course, he took us into our first official declared war since the Revolution, the Barbary Coast War. Now, what's going on here is there in the Mediterranean, off the African coast of Libya, out of a city called Tripoli, there are Muslim pirates who demand tribute of ships. And traditionally, Britain had paid it. And of course, we were British back in the day, and so that took care of it. And then we began to pay it because we figured it was cheaper to pay the pirates off than to do anything about it. But Jefferson says this is wrong, and of course he doesn't like spending government money, and so we stopped paying the Barbary Coast pirates. They declare war on America and begin attacking our ships in 1805. We will engage in the Barbary Coast War, and if you know the Marine hymn, the Marine song, it begins from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is what it's talking about. Now, the war is kind of a draw. Ironically, they do take one of our ships and capture the whole crew. And in the treaty that ends this war, Jefferson refuses to pay any more tribute to the Barbary Coast pirates, but we do end up paying a large ransom for these sailors that kind of amounts to the same as we would have been paying in protection anyway. This is also interesting because in this treaty, Jefferson actually writes the treaty himself. He had been Secretary of State after all. And he actually puts the sentence early on in the treaty, being as the United States is not a Christian nation, which it comes up a lot when we talk about this idea of the religion and the religiosity of the Founding Fathers.